Hi, I am Autumn Dixon with abalancedsaintofmind.com. If you prefer to read something instead of listening to something, you can actually visit this website right here. I post written versions of the videos that I make for my channel. This particular Come Follow Me video is actually the second video I am making for May 11th through 17th. It's Mosiah chapters 18 through 24. And so you might actually find the title kind of interesting because it's about the stripling warriors. And the stripling warriors are not in Mosiah chapters 18 through 24. They are further down the line in the Book of Mormon. However, the stripling warriors, so they are a very inspirational story. I feel like most people who grew up in the church are very familiar with their story. They are young men who took the places of their fathers and went to war. They are young men who listened to their mothers and followed their mothers. They're young men who performed every command with exact obedience, and they are young men who were miraculously preserved by the hand of the Lord. Every single one of them survived this war despite the fact that they were so young. And speaking of young, maybe you figured this out a lot sooner than I did, but when I was younger, I thought that the word stripling meant brave and valiant and strong or whatever it was. That's what I assumed stripling meant. What stripling actually means is young man. Now, the whole reason that they used this adjective was to bring out and emphasize the fact that these boys who were going to war were young. Now, keeping that in mind, we're actually going to go back to Mosiah chapters 18 through 24. And in these chapters, we see Gideon. He is about to kill wicked King Noah. And King Noah looks out and he sees the Lamanites coming in and invading the land and killing some of the Nephites. King Noah pleads for his life from Gideon, and Gideon spares his life, and then everybody starts to flee before the Lamanites. While they are fleeing, apparently the families were slowing down the men, and so King Noah commanded the men to leave their wives and their children and to run away from the Lamanites. Unfortunately, some men chose to follow that command, and they followed King Noah, while other men refused and chose to stay with their families. So, picking up right from there, here's two verses. It's Mosiah chapter 19, verses 13 through 14. It says, "And it came to pass that those who tarried with their wives and their children caused that their fair daughters should stand forth and plead with the Lamanites that they would not slay them. And it came to pass that the Lamanites had compassion on them, for they were charmed with the beauty of their women." It goes on to talk about how the Lamanites spared their lives and they took them captive rather than continuing to kill them. Now, this is literally only 2 verses in the entire Book of Mormon. But there is so much story here. I don't know about you, but I know that as I've read this story in the past, I've thought, wow, that's like really awesome, but I never really thought about what was going on here. The Lamanites are literally in the process of killing Nephites, and somehow the message passed from the fathers to the daughters, asking them to go and stand in front of these Lamanite warriors and plead for the lives of their families. It says very specifically that it wasn't the wives, it was the daughters. I don't know how many daughters were killed before the Lamanites paused long enough to hear the pleadings for their families. Unlike the stripling warriors, there was no detail in these verses that all of the daughters survived. We don't know exactly what happened. There isn't a lot of detail, but there is a lot of story here. Really important story. Like I said before, it wasn't the wives that stood forth, it was the daughters that stood forth. And we don't know how young they were. We don't know the traditional age of marriage for the Nephites of that time. We know that the traditional age of marriage for Judaism was very young. In fact, in that time period, most people married pretty young. And so we know that we can guess beyond a reasonable doubt that these girls were young, just like the stripling warriors. And like the stripling warriors, they were willing to stand up in front of their families and protect their families, and they were willing to do it without a weapon. Now, it says that the Lamanites had compassion on them, for they were charmed with the beauty of their women. And it's really, really, really easy to hyper-focus on the fact that they were charmed with the beauty of their women. But there are two words in these verses that are so much more significant than that phrase. It says that those who tarried with their wives and children caused that their fair daughters should stand forth. So, stand forth. Just out of curiosity, I actually typed stand forth into Google just to see what would come up. And the internet is really interesting because it can give you synonyms for an entire phrase rather than just mere words. And there were 3 synonyms that popped up for this phrase that stood out to me. The first was stand out, loom large, and to show up. When we look at what the stripling warriors have taught the young men in our day, obviously taught the young women as well, but the stripling warriors taught the young men how important it is to listen to your mom, to be exactly obedient, and that the Lord will preserve you to do what you need to be doing. I think it is so significant that the stripling warriors, that these women in these 2 verses, yes, they were beautiful, but they stood forth. They stand out, they loom large, and they showed up. Now, sometimes when you're a young girl, at least when I was a young girl, it was really easy to be shy or to not feel like you were one of those charmingly beautiful women, or to wonder what you can actually contribute or whether you have anything to contribute at all. It's hard to be a young woman, especially in today, like in these modern times. But look at the influence that these young women had on their families. They did something really, really brave. They stood in front of Lamanite warriors and pleaded for their families' lives, and they succeeded. They had a life-saving influence over their families. And I know that if you are willing to stand forth, to stand up and loom large and show up, I know that even as a young woman or a young man or anyone really listening to this video, you can have the same life-saving influence that these young women had in their 2 verses in the Book of Mormon. I know that that's true. I know that the Lord is willing to help us have those kinds of influences if we're willing to stand forth and be brave like the young women in these 2 verses. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.